Welcome back to the podcast. I have been assembling contributors to a Jack Kirby anthology, Jack of All Comics. It was edited by Jim Beard. I've done several shows. Today, I have two more people on. I have Keith DeCandido
Nope.
and Rich Steeves. So I'm going to go with Keith first. Keith, I always ask the same question. What's your origin story and got you started into comic books and made you a lifelong fan?
What introduced me to comics actually was I grew up in New York in the 1970s, and there was a kids show called The Electric Company,
Oh my
which
God.
among the many other things the show did besides make use of all sorts of entertaining people when they were much younger, like Rita Moreno and Morgan Freeman and Tom Lehrer, Joan Rivers, a bunch of other people. They also had a license to do Spider-Man stuff. They did little live action bits with Spider-Man on the show, and they also put out a tie-in comic book called Spidey Super Stories, which my parents got me a subscription to. And that was my introduction to superhero comics. And that led to me reading the various Origins trade paperbacks that they put out in the 70s that had all the origins of all the Marvel characters. Then they also followed that up with Bring on the Bad Guys and Superhero Women and some others. And then I started actually just buying the comics, and it snowballed from there.
Keith, tell the
And I've managed to parlay that into not just an interest as a fan, but also professional. My very first published short story and my very first published novel were both Spider-Man. Spider-Man short story I did in 1994, and a Spider-Man novel I wrote with Jose Arnieto called Venom's Wrath, which came out in 1998. That was the early part of my fiction career, which has continued quite a bit since then. But it all started with Spidey, and so I've been a fan of both a fan and a pro working with superhero comics for a very long time, and it's been wonderful.
Rich, your turn. Same question, and tell the fans also a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I love the electric company. Fargo, North Dakota was
Yes.
fantastic. But I started my neighbor, across the street neighbor, Jim, who I assume will be listening to this because I'll send him the link. He was a big comic book fan. He had caught the bug from his aunt Pat. And so we used to hang out, and he had a stack of comics. And this was when I was maybe 3 or 4 years old. And that's actually how I started to read. I would sit on my dad's lap with an issue of Flash or Justice League or something. And the pictures and the words together helped me learn how to read. And I just loved it. And every time I had a few cents from doing some chores or $5 from my grandmother for my birthday, we'd go to the drugstore. I'd obsess at the spinner rack, pick out comics, and then I just kept reading. And then I think later in life, when other people drifted away from comics, I just got deeper into it, started going to conventions, the local VFW, and yeah, and spending way too much money on them. Yeah, and I got involved in writing fiction. I've written a few novels in the urban fantasy genre and lots of short stories in horror and sci-fi and things. And I'm really excited to be part of these anthologies talking about the history of comics because it's something my term paper in my senior year of high school in my APU's history class was about Frederick Wortham. So I love the history of comics, and it's something I'm excited to tap into and talk to with both of you today.
So I want Keith and then you, Rich. Keith, what made you discover, how did you discover Kirby and what made you a fan of Kirby?
One of my earliest dives into Marvel Comics was the Origins of Marvel Comics trade paperback that was put out. So it had a lot of Kirby's early Marvel superheroes work that he did with Stan Lee, so the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and the Hulk and so on. So that was my first introduction to him. And what I was particularly struck by then and continue to be struck by now is just the sheer kineticism of what he did. The Even though he perfectly embodied the fact that we're talking about still pictures that still have to show motion in some way, and a sequential art. It's a sequence of events, and Kirby was better at that than anyone. And that I didn't know you could do that with pictures. I was also only 10, but it was very, his art in particular was very revelatory. The It jumped out at me in a way different from the other artists who were in that volume. You had Don Ditko's stuff was much more, I don't want to say non-moving, but his stuff was more emotional. That's the word I'm looking for. He was more focused on what the people were feeling just by how they looked. Plus, also, Ditko was way better at psychedelic art, which was the '60s. That was what everybody was doing. But the with Kirby, it was always about the action, and not just in the sense of people beating each other up, but in what people were doing. even if it was something as simple as walking down the street. You felt what was happening there.
What about you, Rich?
Yeah, so similarly, I came to Kirby through reprints. I'm trying to remember what were they called collector's editions? What were those really big
The Treasury
uh,
editions.
Treasury edition? Thank you.
Yeah.
I had the Treasury edition that had the Galactus saga in it, and that was unlike anything that I'd seen at that point. I mostly read, as I said, The Flash and Spider-Man, like you mentioned, Keith, and just the scope and the craziness when Johnny's flying to get the ultimate nullifier, and when the Watcher is shrouding the Earth to hide it from Galactus's view. Those images were great. And I know, Keith, you mentioned how Ditko was very emotional, but I think that's an underrated thing about Kirby too, right? You've got those scenes with the Surfer and with Alicia, and even without Stan's occasionally overwritten dialogue, you can tell what's happening there. And then, of course, I think I'm not alone to say my favorite Kirby work is This Man, This Monster, and you get the Thing has always been unabashedly my favorite character. It was only later in life that I learned that the Thing was so heavily based on Kirby himself and just tapping into that emotion. So it was this combination of these crazy cosmic things, what I would later learn was called Kirby Crackle by some, and these machines and aliens and cosmic things, and that more grounded emotional stuff, because that's what kept bringing me back, right? I like the FF because they were a family, because they fought, and because they made up, and because they really cared about each other. And so I think those combinations really hooked me in. And I think I eventually read all 102 issues of the FF run that Kirby did initially with Stan, but I continue to follow him in other things, even to his work on this. I think the Superpowers comic in the DC in the 80s was something I read. So yeah, I've always loved him, and I was really excited to be part of this book.
So Kirby worked both for DC and Marvel during the 1970s, and I feel in both cases, Kirby's second time around at Marvel and DC, it's like we have Jack, but neither publisher really knew what to do with them in either case. What do you guys think of that? Go ahead, Keith, you first.
I don't think it's entirely fair. To some extent, it wasn't that they didn't know what to do with them, it's that they were afraid to tell him what to do. It's like, this is Jack Kirby. We're not going to. And I think to some extent that was also his own condition for working with them, was being able to work unfettered. Having said that, in both cases, they were letting a legend do what he wanted. And there's something to be said for allowing somebody who is a master of his craft do some passion projects, do something that is meaningful to him. So I think that was a big part of it. It was just that we've got this one of the people who basically is responsible for why superhero comics even exist, and both one of the pioneers of the first wave of superhero comics during the height of its initial wave of popularity during World War II, and then again one of the people responsible for the Renaissance that happened in the 60s. I don't think it was a case of they were flailing about wondering what to do. I think it was just leaving the guy alone and letting him do what he wanted. And he had earned that. By that point, he had earned that.
What about you, Rich? You have anything to add?
Yeah, I think you made an interesting point, Keith, that I've been thinking about. And I think about this with popular writers now. I feel like the later Stephen King books might have been better if there had been a stronger editorial hand that had said, we don't need 900 pages in Under the Dome. But I think Kirby, they did let Kirby do whatever he wanted, right? Famously, he said, give me Jimmy Olsen because it's your worst selling book, and I'll write that. And of course, he produced some pretty crazy and pretty inventive stuff there. But I think if there'd been a little bit more of a stern, not stern editorial hand, but a co-equal
Firm.
editorial hand. What's that?
A firm editorial hand.
A firm. There you go. Firm editorial hand. And also, I think if you had transplanted him into today's marketplace, I think there would have been more opportunities for them to say, okay, the Fourth World is going to be its own imprint, right? These are the Fourth World comics, and you can necessarily let him play around. I think one of the things I talked about in my Eternal essay is that he clearly intended, in my view, for the Eternals to be separate from the Marvel Universe, yet they were dragged into the Marvel Universe eventually. It became a part of it. And I think nowadays with other imprints and maybe even smaller publishers, you could have had Kirby say, here's your sandbox, play around, do whatever you want, but have that firmer hand. I think that's the right word, Keith, to guide him and say, maybe focus more on this, or maybe don't write 4 Fourth World books and focus on 2 or something like that.
So, Keith, how did you get involved with the Jack book, and why do you think Kirby went back to Captain America when he returned to Marvel?
The Jack book was just simply a case of Jim saying, "Hey, want to work on my Jack Kirby book?" And I said yes. I've done a lot of work, a lot of essays for Jim's various essay collections over the last few years, and I love working with Jim, and I love the subjects he picks. I pushed to get Captain America, which is rare. Usually, when Jim has one of these things, I don't get around to it. And by the time I finally have the chance to put something in, I get stuck with whatever's left. I wanted specifically his run on Cap. And I think that there are two reasons why he particularly wanted that at that time. One, he co-created Captain America. Of course he wanted to work on it. That was him and his and Joe Simon's baby. The other reason is specifically what year it was. That was 1976, and it was the bicentennial. 50 years on, it's hard to remember. This country was absolutely gripped with bicentennial fever in 1976. It was a major thing. I grew up and still live in New York, and here especially, it was a complete, the entire city was given over to bicentennial craziness, particularly in the summer. And so Captain America, the bicentennial, it's like, how could he not? So I think that was the impetus for him. And from Marvel's point of view, it's like the guy who created Captain America wants to write it. Of course, we're going to let him do it.
Did you think the Treasury, how do you think the Treasury helped or maybe even hindered Jack when he was putting it together?
The Treasury? I'm not sure what that.
Yeah, no, the bicentennial Treasury that Jack did, the big oversized one.
Oh, okay. I didn't actually read that. I didn't. Oh, God, I haven't reread that in ages.
The Captain America the Captain America storylines, the whole book really didn't connect with the Marvel mythos during his run. Did that help or take away from Captain America's popularity during the time?
And I don't know if it mattered one way or the other. It was still definitely part of the Marvel Universe. It didn't actively connect. One thing that actually impressed me, the Falcon, at the time, it wasn't actually Captain America. It was Captain America and the Falcon, and had been for some time and would continue to be for a while afterwards. And it's to Kirby's credit that he did not write Sam Wilson out. The Falcon was his equal partner throughout that entire run. There was a lot of stuff that was, and S.H.I.E.L.D. was still part of it too. We never saw Nick Fury during his entire run, but S.H.I.E.L.D. was still a supporting element. So he didn't completely divorce it. He just focused it. And Sharon Carter was still a supporting character, and Sam's girlfriend was also still part of it. So it wasn't a complete divorcing from the rest of the Marvel Universe. But it did focus exclusively on Steve and Sam. And the only part of it really twigged me when I was reading it, there was actually an issue of Marvel Team Up that was a continuation of something that started in Cap's comic. And if you just read Cap's comic, you have no idea that issue of Marvel Team Up ever existed. If you read Marvel Team Up, yeah, there it is and says this continues from this issue of Cap, which was weird and a very un-Marvel-like bit of marketing or lack of saying. Marvel was usually really good about making sure you knew about their crossovers. And I'm wondering if that was like a condition of Kirby's working on it or something. But just because that was so unusual. He did a lot of weird stuff. And interestingly enough, a lot of what he created, with the sole exception of Arnim Zola, was all stuff he created, and except for Arnim Zola, none of it was ever referenced ever again. It almost feels like it existed in its own time-space continuum. And if J.M. DeMatteis hadn't brought Arnim Zola back a bunch of issues later, I don't know, 6-7 years later, we wouldn't have seen any of what he did ever again in the book.
So his big storyline was that Mad Bomb storyline that went from 193 and through 300. It was politically charged. It was a conspiracy to overthrow the democracy.
Yeah.
What do you think was his ideas for doing that? 'Cause it's different than what Kirby would normally do.
It was a big, nasty, bad guy, obviously. But he was trying to do something that, again, we're back to the bicentennial again, and it's the 200th issue. He was trying to do something that would have an effect on America, as it were. Something that would challenge the ideals of the country. And what we saw was him fighting a bad guy who wanted to bring America back to basically what it was under British rule, which is a fundamental thing. So I think what he was working on was something that was conscientious of when it took place in terms of American history and in terms of Cap's history.
How do you think it holds up after all this time and among Kirby's Bronze Age work?
Some of it is actually the whole thing about the people who were followers of this underground group that wanted to take over America were people who wanted to be led by the wealthy. Some of it still resonates now, let's just put it that way, to a degree that's actually appalling. So it actually held up better than I really wish it did. That story in particular, the struggle of democracy versus fascism is something that is sadly eternal. It worked in World War II, it worked in the 70s, it works now.
Do you know why he left Captain America after that brief run?
He was on it for a couple of years,
Yeah.
but he pretty much stopped working for Marvel. His contract with Marvel ran out and he didn't renew it. But I think he stayed for it for his entire run while he was back at Marvel during that period. I don't know. I don't know the specifics. I didn't really get into that, and I don't
Okay.
remember.
Just curious about that.
Yeah.
So, Rich, how did you end up doing the Eternals?
I ended up similar to Keith. I've worked with Jim before. Jim is fantastic. And I had just done an essay for Walking the Wider Web, which was the retrospective on Marvel Team Up. And I know, Keith, you did some work in there as well.
Yep.
And similar to actually the opposite of Keith. He seemed eager to do the Cap, and I was open to doing almost anything, right? I assumed people would snatch up the 60s FF and some of the other more prominent runs, the 40s Captain America. So I was open to a lot of things. And I was actually really excited to get Eternals, not just because my wife had hated the movie and I wanted to return to the source material, but it was on my mind because I think there were a lot of missed opportunities in the movie. But I also, as a kid, I had pulled out of a long box an issue of the Eternals with the Unimind, and I had been fixated on this concept for a long time. So I was really happy to get the Eternals, and it really, as I talked about in my essay, I thought of it as a culmination of a lot of different things Kirby had done, for better or for worse, throughout his career.
So, the Eternals came out around 1976, and Marvel was a very different type of company during the 70s. What is it, just because it was Jack Kirby, or did they have more of like a reason to do something so mythology driven with the Eternals?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the behind the scenes machinations, but I get the sense that, as we had alluded to earlier, they wanted to let Kirby do Kirby, right? And he had sort of, I think it's hard to ignore some of the similarities with the Eternals work and with the Fourth World work from DC, but I got the sense they were like, what do you got, Jack? What do you have in your brain that you want to work on? And I feel, as Keith mentioned, around the same time he was working on Cap, which was a character he'd been tied to for 35 years. And he also at the same time did something that was brand new and fresh. And so I get the sense, again, as I said, I don't know where Marvel editorial or the publishers were, but that's the sense I get, that they were like, do this classic character and then go wild and do something new from your brain.
Do you think that the Eternals is like an expansion of his storytelling and cosmic work that you saw in Thor and then New Gods and into Eternals? Does that like all connect together in his evolution of that type of stuff?
Yeah, I talked about that in my piece. I think I also included the Inhumans in there as well. I feel like we were pulling threads from all of those, right? With the Inhumans, you had this sort of secret society of powered individuals that were on Earth in the Himalayas for centuries. I think with the Inhumans, you had the cosmic, right? You talked about that with Thor, and then of course in the Fourth World stuff, you had this whole new mythology, but that was mythology that was based in space, right? You had Apocalypse, you had New Genesis, you had all those characters, and this was pulling that back to Earth. And it's no secret, right? Jack was interested in things like Chariots of the Gods and some of those ideas in the 70s. And so connecting this cosmic interest in mythology to actual real world mythology, right? When I was a kid, it was one of those moments of a light bulb going off where I was like, Circe, there's a character in the Odyssey named Circe. Wait a minute. And you go back and you look and you're like, oh, wait, okay, I see what he's doing. He's got Athena and Icarus and Zurus, right? All these characters. And so having that spirit of mythology that he had mined in the New Gods, and the Fourth World stuff, the hidden society that he'd done in the Inhumans, and then tying it into our mythology really did feel to me like a culmination of a lot of the threads he'd been weaving throughout his entire career.
He had the Celestials. I don't think anybody could have created such a visually dynamic thing like the Celestials than Jack Kirby.
They're crazy when you look at it. First of all, I talked about how much I loved Galactus, and part of what my little brain loved about Galactus is he was so big, right? He's towering over New York City, and then you get to the Celestials, and they tower over Galactus the way Galactus towers over me, and then just the design, the intricacies of the way they look, and are they wearing armor? Is that their skin? What is going on? And there's so many more questions, right? A towering figure that just stands there and you can't understand it, right? We think about Galactus and how we are like ants into Galactus, and ants can't understand us. We could understand Galactus. He's hungry. He wants to eat. The Celestials just seem so far removed from our consciousness, and I think that's present in their design, in the strong colors, the Kirby-esque designs on their forms, the question about what really they are. Yeah, I think that's the Kirbyest Kirby that ever Kirbyed.
Is there an issue that you thought really stood out among them all?
What I loved, and I thought about this a lot. I loved the way he just rolled out the different characters, and you got different focus characters. And so my favorite was the Cersei issue. I've always loved Cersei, even though I didn't love how she was necessarily handled in the 90s when she was on the Avengers. She was always a character that interested me, partly because of her connection to the Odyssey and the idea that it was the same Cersei. So as Ike Harris is taking us through, and I really loved how those first few issues were put together. We're following Icarus and leading us to the different members of the Eternals. And we get to Cersei, that opening shot of Cersei in her pose that's both sexy and mysterious at the same time, how she's living the high life in New York and everything. That for me was my favorite. There's a lot of great stuff in there. There's a lot of bombast and cosmic stuff, but for me that was a character that made a lasting impression on me and made a lasting impression on the Marvel U, and I love the way she's introduced.
So, where do you think the Eternals stand in both DC and Marvel during the 1970s as a series, and then the mythology they actually introduced, which now carries forward into Marvel today?
Yeah, that's a great question because, again, I feel like they got a little bit of short shrift, right? He clearly had lots of stories he wanted to tell. 18 issues in an annual doesn't feel like enough to explore everything he wanted to do. And as it's been mined by other creators and other generations, I feel like they have a lot of reference to it. They clearly sparked a lot of imagination for a lot of the creators, but I feel like tying them into the Marvel universe might have been a mistake. If they'd had an opportunity to keep them as their own thing, I think that would have been more interesting to me. Once suddenly you have Icarus alongside of the Hulk, it loses a little bit of something. So, I know that there's been a lot of good stories with them through the decades. There was some recent good limited series with the Eternals. I feel like they've never quite clicked as a group and as a sandbox to tell stories in as they might have. I think part of that was because it was just such a short run in the first place, and there are some corners that people are always unsure whether to retell the same stories or pick at different corners. And I'm not sure anybody's quite found the right in to that property, in my opinion, since.
So
The thing is,
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
it only had 18 issues because nobody freaking read it. It was canceled due to low sales. And that's been a perpetual problem for the Eternals. It's the concept has never actually been popular among the readership. And no one's ever been able to really figure out how to make it work, up to and including Kevin Feige. It's a nifty concept, but part of it is he did it elsewhere in some ways. And then later writers integrated it into things like the Inhumans and the Skrulls and all the stuff with Thanos and Mentor and the rest of the gang.
Eternals, yeah.
Tying that into the Eternals, which helped a little because people actually cared about those stories. But not to be mean or anything, but the reason why it was such a short run is because it was canceled due to poor sales, which was, I think, the only one of the books he worked on that had that problem.
Yeah, and I think as I read through it, it was a little bit of a slog to go through. I talked earlier about how Stan sort of overwrote dialogue sometimes. There are times where I wish someone had just told Jack to let his art stand. These giant word balloons that cover the beautiful art and that explain what you're already seeing in this sort of overwritten way. And I think maybe sometimes the swings were too big. There was too much going on, and maybe that's why people lost interest in it. Maybe if he had tied more, if there had been more Hulk cameos early on, it would have brought more eyeballs to it.
So, Keith, how accessible is Kirby for new fans, and how should they approach Jack? And I want you to answer the same question, Rich.
That's a tough one because he's, for one thing, and I didn't actually phrase it this way in my essay specifically because Jim was very careful to make sure that this was a celebration of Jack Kirby and not a roasting of Jack Kirby. As a scripter of comics, Jack Kirby was not very good. His story sense was phenomenal. His art obviously was stupendous, but his actual captions and dialogue were very clunky. And one of the biggest struggles reading through the Captain America and the Falcon issues was getting through that dialogue and very, very basic characterization. A lot of the characters are very thin and simplistic in far too many ways. and he was terrible at writing women. Oh God. And so that's a big stumbling block, I think, to reading his stuff now. It's not like a lot of stuff, like especially a lot of the stuff that Stan and Jack did in the 60s and that Stan did with Steve Ditko in the 60s and so on. A lot of the writing that guys like Stan Lee and Roy Thomas and the others did, and then it looks dated now, obviously, just because styles have changed in the last 60 years. But the Kirby stuff, I think, is just difficult to get through from a writing perspective, and that's a real challenge. The art is still amazing. The man could do amazing things just with eyes, and it's funny because I can always tell when somebody is relatively new to being an artist because one of the hardest things to draw are eyes. And I've seen a lot of newbie artists who really just can't nail eyes at all. Kirby was amazing at that. You could always tell what people were feeling just by what they were doing with their eyes in his work. So I think his art is still very much accessible for all that it's not very similar to what anybody's doing right now, even though there are plenty of people who are very obviously influenced by him, even if second generation influenced by him. The people who grew up on Kirby then became artists themselves, and the people drawing now grew up on the people who grew up on Kirby. His influence is obvious, and like I said, that kineticism stands out no matter what. But I think it's tough, and it would be hard for somebody used to contemporary writing and who doesn't have much experience with stuff from that era to get into it.
What about you, Rich?
I can echo a lot of what Keith said. I think part of it is the way that comics have evolved. Even when go back and reread comics from the 80s, they're written more densely, right? They have more narrative captions and things. And so obviously going back to read stuff from the 40s through the 70s is going to be a very different experience. They have this sort of exploded storytelling now where they might take 6 issues to tell a story that in the 60s would have been a one-issue story. So there's that part of it, but I also agree when Kirby was scripting and writing his own dialogue and things, I mentioned that earlier with the Eternals, some of the speeches were just so long and you just had to read through them. But I think he's got such a breadth of work that you could probably find something in there that would appeal to somebody, right? Even if it's just looking at those Thor issues that you mentioned earlier and the cosmic scope of them. And I think Keith's absolutely right. Whenever you study an art form that's evolved, right? If you're studying rock and roll, you want to go back and learn about the blues, right? If you're studying the history of comic art, Kirby is maybe, if not the most important artist, along with Eisner and others, one of the most important because he was there in the early days of the genre, sort of creating the language of it, but then he was doing things that were different from a lot of people. And as Keith mentioned, that influenced generations afterwards. I think his work is sometimes a little bit dense and would lose people, but I think certain stories hold up no matter what. And I think his character designs, his style, and his influence are something that anybody can appreciate.
We're just going to end this anyways. Rich, Keith, thanks for joining me on the podcast. They're the 2 contributors from Jack of All Comics. You can available anywhere just about you can find it. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks, Ronald. Take care.